All right, good afternoon. Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas Ground Truth. This talk is... the slide. Model Robustness Isn't Security by Sven Cattell. A few announcements before we begin. We'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors LastPass and Palo Alto Networks, and our gold sponsors Amazon, Intel, and Google. It is their support, along with our other sponsors, donors, and volunteers, that make this event possible. The talks are being live streamed, except for Underground Track, and as a courtesy to our speakers and audience, we ask that you check to make sure your cell phones are set to silent or vibrate. If you have a question, raise your hand. We currently don't have the wireless mics active, so you will have to speak kind of loud, and we'll just have the speaker repeat your question. There's interference from the mics in another room, so that's what we got to do. As a reminder, the BSidesLV photo policy prohibits taking pictures without the explicit permission of everyone in frame. These talks are all being recorded, except of course in Underground, and will be available on YouTube in the future. We would like you to please keep your masks on at all times, and if you need to move closer to people to adjust your view or hearing, please also respect social distancing. With that, let's get started. Welcome, Sven.
Hi, so I'm Sven Cattell, and this is my talk on model robustness and security. So I'm giving this talk because there's some movements in the policy space and a lot of academic thing that is claiming that model robustness is absolutely essential for security. And I know of no one security company who actually thinks model robustness should be included in security, and dozens that think, but this is pointless. But because there's a lot of loud people that are arguing that this is security, this is a thing. So about me, I founded a startup sort of in this space, doesn't actually relate to model robustness. Got a PhD in algebraic topology from Johns Hopkins and a postdoc in geometric machine learning. I founded the AI Village 6 years ago. We're going to be at DevCon for the 5th time this year, so woo. I used to work at Endgame Elastic on their large malware models. My Twitter is at CodeMathematician. You can find the slides on GitHub. So, because I'm making an argument that is a little thing here, I have a lot of slides. You can see there's 55 of them. So there's some of these slides that are here mostly to cover my ass in the argument space that aren't necessarily here for the narrative. So this is mainly an argument about definitions, because things, there's a technical definition and the layman's definition, and they're a bit different. So the layman definition that is here for everyone is here. OpenAI. Adversarial examples are inputs to machine learning models that the attacker has intentionally designed to cause the model to make a mistake. They're like optical illusions for machines. And adversarial examples are special for TensorFlow. Adversarial examples are specialized inputs created with the purpose of confusing a neural network, resulting in the misclassification of general input. This sounds like a legit thing that we need to be worried about. We need to worry about adversarial examples from these two definitions, because specialized input that causes misbehavior is sort of the key for a lot of security. A Stack Overflow or a use after free bug, that's specialized. To actually take advantage of that, that's specialized input. All the Metasploit is specialized input. So that sounds like a serious security vulnerability. But these are machine learning models, so any model error, because these are the statistical models, they are not guaranteed. Any model can fit the definition if you kind of squint at it. This is not actually close to what the definition of what practitioners who actually work in the space mean. And if you use this definition, people can sell you snake oil. And even if you don't use this definition, people can sell you snake oil. And snake oil is being sold in this space. The definition for a robust model, and the thing is there's two different meanings of the word robust, but this is what gets thrown around for adversarial robustness and the other robustness. So it's sort of, your model is good. And the problem with that definition is both of those definitions basically mean your model is good. You trained it on enough data that it actually generalizes well. But the problem with this model is they get to check that it's robust by wiggling some minor parameters and not actually testing on proper stuff. So these are the definitions I'm hoping you walk away with at the end, and we're going to go through them point by point. So if you want, go look at the slides online, but we're going to get started on what is a neighborhood. So this is the definition of a neighborhood that I use as a mathematician. The first one, so you see there's two different ones that look almost identical. One is the L2 ball, and the one is the L infinity ball. And the L2 ball forms spheres that are nice and neat, that you are familiar with, and the L infinity ball forms cubes and hypercubes, and spheres and hyperspheres. But that's the definition that I look at and think spheres and cubes. But we can't show that to executives. Part of the thing is neighborhoods get really complicated in higher dimensions. So here there's a big sum over k elements, and that k could be 3,000 or more in the case of machine learning, and that gets really funky. So I'm going to show you why it gets so funky. This is a classic problem that you give to little kids. If you want a rope that goes around the Earth, how much longer than the circumference of the Earth do you need to make it? It turns out it's just 2 pi feet longer to make it sit 1 foot off the Earth. And if you give this to a little kid, they get confused and tell you it's going to have to be much longer than that. Also, with dimensionality, you've got the scaling laws. If the height of a 3D object, the volume of the 3D object grows with the height, the square of the height, and the surface area of a 3D object grows with the square of the height, and the volume grows with the cube. Because of that, large mammals have difficulty with heat. So elephants have big flappy ears to combat the squaring law in dimensions. And it gets much more complicated than this. This is a puzzle that if you ask at a math conference, and people have done this and polled the mathematicians of like what happens, they get it wrong. If you build this thing where you get a cube, you put 8 little spheres in each of the corners, and then you embed a sphere in the middle that's just touching them, like this 2D example, and then you get a hypercube where you have 16 spheres in the corner and the little guy touching in the middle. At 10 dimensions, the little guy sticks out the sides of the actual cube, and as you grow the size of it, the little circle in the middle eventually becomes infinite volume. And so dimensions and things get really weird, and even mathematicians who are trained, like we give each other dimension puzzles all the time, and you can present this at a conference and you're going to get a lot of wrong answers. So dimensions are weird, and here's how it kind of relates to the security space. So MNIST is a data set that everyone in machine learning tests their models against. It's been sort of a benchmark data set for donkey's years. Jan LeCun released it in early 90s. It's 50,000 digits, and it's each image of that is a 28 by 28 8-bit pixel image. So each thing is 256 values, and there's 784 dimensions because 24 squared. And so you get that if you just vary the pixel value either up by 1, down by 1, or 0, so you have 3 options. So you can change each pixel you can change is 3 things. There's 784, so you get 3 to the power of 784. And that works out to be about 1,200 bits of information in terms of like the bits of information that a cryptographic key would be. So dimensions get really weird for even really small machine learning problems. And this is like the tiniest. This was solved back in the 90s. This isn't a problem these days. So what you really need to understand of like what is a neighborhood and how this relates to machine learning is machine learning operates in high dimensional space, and the volume of this space grows exponentially with dimension. There's little white lies in everything I'm saying, but it grows exponentially, and this sort of shows up in machine learning over and over again in the curse of dimensionality. If you have a clustering algorithm and you've got and you want to prove that it converges, well, pretty much always you're going to say, well, I require 2 to the d amount of data in that scaling factor to prove that this converges. So that d is this dimension. If you need it to converge, you need an exponentially growing amount of data to actually get it to prove that it converges. So that's the curse of dimensionality, and you keep showing up and over again. So this is one major problem that shows up all the time in traditional machine learning, and since we don't make proofs about deep learning, it doesn't really show up. It's not really spoken about, but it does show up in the stuff that we're talking about today. So now that you kind of get a bit of an idea of like something about the geometry of the space, we're going to talk about adversarial examples and you'll see why this relates to what a dimension is in a bit. So this is the, I think, legally required image for adversarial examples. This is the panda given image from the second major paper from Ian Goodfellow, Christian Shedging, and a bunch of other authors that I do not remember the names of. And he built a cheap way of producing adversarial examples that you could get a panda, add this formula here that's designed to fit within the epsilon ball, the little ball around your point, and produces this way of confusing a neural network. This is the actual definition that they're working with. So if you have a point and you've got in this, you've got a decision boundary that comes down the thing. You've got some green points, you've got some blue points, and you have this red area where this thing. So that X is the point we care about. That we put a little ball around it, and because the decision boundary is so close to X, there's some points on the other side of it. Because of curse of dimensionality, this is always true, basically. So this is the definition that we work with. The adversarial examples are things that are close to my point that are across the side, the dimensionality thing, decision boundary. So the actual definition of adversarial example that people work with is that, and that's kind of complicated. Basically, it just means this. It's like I want there to be no point. An adversarial example is a point that's on the other side of the decision boundary within my little epsilon ball. So that looks all complicated, but it's not that actually. It's not that complicated. You can code up what that means in Python, but in math, that's how we write it. So for robustness, you use that definition, and you sort of like ask that no point. There's no adversarial examples within an epsilon ball of any of my points. So you see the math definition on the top, and all that means is all my points are outside of this circle. So down here, there's that red point. That is the only point that violates this definition. So if we didn't have that red point, this model would be robust. So that's all. All we're asking is like the decision boundary is just outside of this little circle around my stuff. And now, so here I'm going to get into the issues. So the first major issue is data just moves. So once you train a model, you get this thing, data moves. You release my data thing. Second issue is it's impossible to check because of the volume stuff. You can't do it. Third issue, it's impossible to make an adversarial robust model in most cases. In the cases that we care about as security people. Fourth issue is it lowers accuracy. So first issue, data just moves. So I have a model here, and I've trained it up, and I've got a bunch of green points and a bunch of blue points, and I trained up a model, and the model came up with this decision boundary. So everything on this side of that line is going to be classified as green. Everything on that side of the line is going to be classified as blue. And that looks like a pretty good line. And for some reason, it's just gone this length up because models, it doesn't really have data over here, so it just made something up. But, and at this point, I've gone on a deadline, I have to train up to this point, and then I have to deploy and send this to my customers. So I get points from a month later, and these are my new points. These are ones in these boxes. And you can see the decision boundary is bad. The model didn't predict that the data from later in the month is going to be over here. It just kind of made it, and it's got misclassifying all these green points. So if your model was robust before, you're good, but your data moved, and it moved in a way that your model couldn't have predicted and doesn't know about. So that didn't help you. The robustness doesn't help you if the data just moves in a way. We have this problem. So this is some data that from when I was working at Elastic. We published this at ICML, but you can see there's a very interesting thing that happens here. So what this model is, I had trained up the production model that we release, sort of a smaller version of it for just testing purposes. And I trained it on all data up to January 1st, 2019. So it doesn't know anything about the future. It thinks it has only got data from before the new year of 2019. So it predicts well. You can see the false positive rate as I do a historical analysis. It's good. It's very low. It's really low for a model. So, and that's what I care about. I care about very low false positive rate, very low false negative rate. That's my accuracy. And then the very low error rate overall. But as you can see, about 3 months after I released the model, 3 months after, this one wasn't deployed, but 3 months after, there's a spike in the false negative rate. What happened was there was some malware family that figured out a bypass that became prominent and showed up. So there was a bypass for a malware family. And in our case, the malware authors know what virus total is. They can check if they have a bypass. They can check if they've got, or if their malware is correctly classified. They can check if the AV vendors and the EDR vendors are going to catch them. And they do that. And so they will look for areas that aren't in their space, and they will find a bypass. And you can see later on, over a year after this thing model is it's got this massive spike, which would be completely unacceptable. This is not percent. This is a thing. So this is a massive spike that would be completely unacceptable. You can't deploy a model that's that bad. But that robustness wouldn't have saved this. The red line is the measurement of the drift. The green, blue, and orange lines are the ones that you really care about in this image. Another issue with robustness, it's impossible to check for robustness. So getting back to the thing, if I want a robustness radius of 1 pixel, the number of bits of information for an L2 ball is 10. That means it's equivalent. You've got to guess 2 to the 10 different things in order to test all the values. You have to go through 2 to the 10 different things to test all the values. But when I've got an L infinity ball, which a lot of these things are claiming a robustness to, I have to check 1200, 2 to the 1200, and that's not, and this is just for MNIST. This isn't for a real model. This isn't for real images. This is just MNIST. And when I increase the size of the ball for L2 balls, once I hit 7, well, that means checking a L2 ball of 7 pixels around a value of say 7 values around a point in an MNIST model has much more bits than an AE breaking a 256-bit encryption key. So you have to brute force like AES 256-bit encryption, and that's easier than checking 7 pixels away from MNIST. The radius is normally almost more than 70, not 7. So there's a lie in what I told you. This is a slice of how a neural network actually perceives data. The idea from this comes with a field of math called the tropical geometry. If you know your cryptography and your finite fields, this is the geometry of the field of one element. And it relates to neural networks. So this is actually sort of what you have to check instead of just the bit pixels. And what I care about is if I have my image, my point is going to be in one of these sectors. So if there's a solid colored polytope, my example is going to be in one of those things. And when I cross the boundary to another color image, that means that the classification could have changed. So sort of the decision boundary of a neural network is going to be contained in the edges of this image. And this is a slice of the MNIST, of a neural network slice trained on MNIST. This is just a two-dimensional slice of a many thousand-dimensional space. So it's much more complicated than this. And if I want to be completely honest about my estimate for the number of bits I have to check, using the geometry of the neural network, information about the geometry of the neural network, it's actually more like this. So it means using all the math to reduce the problem space as much as possible to save yourself as much time, which is what cryptographers would do if you have a really bad way of generating a key that actually doesn't have the full 256-bit encryption bits of entropy. It only has 90 bits of entropy. Then cryptographers can take advantage of that because they know math tricks. Well, if for neural networks, if you know the geometry of it, you can take advantage of it to save yourself a lot of time. And with using all that, well, you don't get to 7, you get to 10. So even with the math tricks, you don't get much further. So another way of making things robust is adversarially training them. And this is the algorithm, basically the algorithm for making adversarially training things. So you can make adversarial examples in some really cheap ways and just include those in your training data. Like always train your network on adversarial examples so that it's always going to, to make sure that it classifies the adversarial examples correctly. So you're going to use the fast gradient sign method, just start tossing in fast gradient sign method generated adversarial examples. And that's what these are. This R star is the adversarial example that you're going to generate. And you're just going to toss it in there and train on both your normal samples and these adversarial examples. So the problem with this is the first line, is this line. Find an attack permutation, R star. Well, as we just said, there's that many attack permutations. Yeah, that's the space you have to search over to find a different attack permutation. So that is basically, you're going to find one, you're going to use your maybe 10 different ways of generating an adversarial example, and you're going to train your neural network to correctly classify that type of adversarial example. And there are many different ways to build an adversarial example. It is not just one. There are boatloads of ways. So robustness training is a dead end and has been a dead end for a while, but there are companies that will sell you robustness training for making your model robust. They are scamming you. Another issue with robustness, this is another way you can make things robust. This is a Lipschitz continuous thing. So what this Lipschitz requires is if I give a point, I can make this like slash diagram and this like cone of light, if you're familiar with special relativity. So my function has to be within this shaded area. What this means is if I have my function spikes up, goes from here and spikes up and goes there, it's changing too quickly. So I can make my constant small and say at this point I am robust, it's classifying these correctly. And then if I move right next door, I'm over here and I've changed too quickly. So that's not good. So I'm going to require that my function changes slowly. And so for my neural network, I'm going to require that it changes slowly. And so I'm going to make things Lipschitz, named after an old mathematician. And this isn't ready for production. The way they do this is they require regularization. And they toss in that your neural network can't do this, and they require the actual way they do this is wrong. So this isn't ready for production. This is another way. If you have images, you can make a thing robust. What you do is because my neural network, my adversarial example, is sort of a noise, is within the noise bounds, I add some more noise, and then I remove the noise using for example, diffusion model. This model here is the latent diffusion model that's available on Hugging Face and GitHub. And what you can do is, if you have an image model, just add a little bit more noise, and then remove the noise using your diffusion model. Add some noise, remove it. There's a bunch of other ways of doing this. You can use high frequency things from image processing, remove all the high frequency information because the adversarial examples tend to be high frequency information. Most of the ways don't work. This way probably works. The people didn't prove it mathematically, but it has some really good results, and that's the best we can do in machine learning. Cool. So here's a reason why you wouldn't want, the first couple reasons, or you can't get it. You can't make a model robust. Here's a reason why you don't want your model to be robust. You don't actually want this thing. It's actually a bad quality in many cases. So I have my this is a diagram I stole from this paper over here. I have my green points, my blue points, and my line separating them. And I've classified, and this line correctly classifies them all. So I then put my little L infinity spheres around them, my cubes, and I'm going to require that this model be robust. And you can see that the decision boundary goes through a bunch of those cubes. So this model isn't robust from this epsilon ball and these definitions. So my model actually, to be robust, has to be this red wiggly line that wastes a lot of compute to actually make that red wiggly line. It's possible to do, but you now have this thing where you have to make this red wiggly line. What this means is your model actually ends up being less accurate. So this 0 is the standard model. This would be the accuracy of the standard model. Something that is 1 pixel robust is a lot more. It has got nearly 4 times the error rate of 1 pixel. 3 times the error rate of a thing when I have a small amount of data. So this is 3 times the error rate for 1 pixel value robust, 2 pixel value robust, and so on. And as I add more data, the error rate goes back down, but I need a lot of, if you actually follow this through, it's asymptotic, so you're always going to be making a trade-off. And this is for MNIST. For ImageNet and CFAR, it's worse. You require much bigger robustness, and you get a lot, with an L2 ball of a reasonable amount, it drops off drastically. So the accuracy is a huge trade-off. So do you want your model to be robust? Well, maybe not. Maybe you spend way too much in accuracy to actually make your model robust. This is, it is, in many cases, it's probably much more secure to have an accurate model that generalizes well than to have a robust model, because the accuracy is more important, especially in malware models, than the robustness, because you need your false positive rate to be below the annoyance threshold of your analysts. And to accomplish that, and the annoyance threshold of your analysts, because of how many binaries are passing through your network, is really low, so you need a false positive rate of 0.01% or something like that. To get an accuracy rate of that low, you can't make a trade-off of that much. Even in a tiny bit of robustness, this trade-off would kill the performance of your malware model. So you don't want to make this trade-off for security data. And image data, if you have a X-ray machine, would you want your model, would you feel comfort that your model made a mistake because they made it robust? Like, oh no, we could maybe get attacked by a hypothetical adversary if they got into my network and started messing with image data instead of just ransomwaring the hospital. They could ransomware the hospital or mess with image data. in a very particular way that requires a lot of expertise. Well, to guard against that weird edge case, some hospitals are spending money on robustness and not spending money on like improving the model thing. There is other definitions of robust, but for security applications, it is not the thing. And those other definitions of robust suffer from the same dimensionality problems as regular robustness. The only way to fight more robustness correctly is to get more data. More data, more high quality data. There's no point in spending money and effort on fancy tricks to make your model robust. Is just get more data. Even if you have a robustness technique, you want more data. So don't invest in that, invest in getting more data. Anyway, so now that I've said that it's pointless thing, let's talk about the reason why you would want this is you're trying to prevent a bypass. And now to tell you about how bypasses actually work. So the first major machine learning attack was against spam filtering. Probably the first deployment of machine learning in security was in 2002, and they deployed naive Bayes for spam. If you want to learn what naive Bayes are, there's a workshop at the AA Village that a friend of mine is giving. By 2004, Sophos, who was running one of these things commercially, had seen these attacks. So people were obfuscating the text. They were using the normal thing of putting HTML percent characters instead of actually writing out the text. So it would be rendered in the HTML engine as proper stuff, but it was actually rendered as human legible, but it was not legible to machine. So they obfuscated the text. Because they know that the AI model is a machine thing, so it's has to read the text. They would also put a small email with just a link, like follow this link to your Viagra, to my Viagra thing. And then they would hide the emails in a non-deliverable because of the way that was delivered. It was sort of a payload inside the email, so that the spam system didn't open the payload the same way as it opened the regular email, so they would be able to get past the spam email by basically packing the email, which is a problem for machine learning models for malware as well. And then the last thing is the most famous attack, packing in good words. So if you have a spam email that's trying to get you to give money to your cousin, of Prince, you would then just put a Wikipedia article at the bottom of that, because the Wikipedia article is good, and the Bayesian filter counted the number of good words and bad words and kind of checked on how that worked. These aren't the adversarial examples that academics are studying. These are someone sat down, read the paper on how the Bayesian filters work, and had a good think, and then made up these strategies. And this is still what's happening today. Spammers who are spamming Facebook, every few days, Facebook deploys in a new spam model to prevent things from going through. Spammers get together, try a bunch of stuff, and then communicate, figure out a bypass, and then communicate it to each other. It spreads quickly. Facebook now has a model that's out of date. They have to redeploy 3 or 4 days later, because that's the value of getting spam on Facebook is that high that the spammers are going to put that much money into just getting 5,000 people in a room that are very poorly paid to bypass the model. And once one of them figures it out, they communicate, and now they have a bypass. But they work like this. They have guesses for how the spam model works. They have read some academic papers, but they don't really understand them. They are just trying to guess why it passes. So here's a machine learning attack against a malware model. So if you want to learn about how malware models actually work, you want to look up Elastic Ember's featureization system from Hiram Anderson and Phil Roth. And so you take the idea of how this works is you take a PE file, and this is the classic picture of what a PE file looks like from Wikipedia. You featureize it into a JSON blob that has all sorts of useful information, like the size of sections, the number of bytes, the histogram of the bytes, the entropy, the number of strings, the import list, all sorts of stuff. And then you put it in a high dimensional space. So for Ember, it puts it in a 2,381 dimensional space. 1,024 of those dimensions are just encoding your imports table, because imports are really important for checking out whether we're doing static analysis of binary. In 2019, a pair of researchers figured out a reverse-engineered Cylance malware detection system. So it works the same way. So it's got your PE file, injects it into a 7,000 dimensional space this time instead of 2,300 dimensional space, but through the same intermediary format, and then to a deep learning model, and the deep learning model figures it out whether it's good or bad. So that's how the machine learning model is supposed to work. But the problem that they were having was that Fortnite does some shady stuff to make sure that you're not cheating. Rocket League does the same thing. These things, these are binaries that you might not want on your corporate network, but Cylance sells to people, and they have installed Fortnite on their computer, and Fortnite should run. And it's very easy for the machine learning model to confuse Fortnite with malware, because Fortnite does some weird stuff with process injection to make sure that you're not cheating. So what Cylance did to fight this, instead of putting Fortnite and Rocket League and everything on an exception list, which they'd have to update every single time that Fortnite updates, they use some machine learning. So they normalize the features and then put it into a centroid thing. And they used the concepts from earlier. They put a little neighborhood around the point that represented Fortnite that they thought. And if you're a binary who gets featurized from your PE space, ends up in that centroid for Fortnite, they will let you run. So instead of letting the machine learning model figure this out and then telling them, like, hey, really, don't misclassify Fortnite, they need to run on our customers' machines, they use this trick to sort of put in all of Fortnite, hopefully forever, on the exception list. And they did this for a bunch of other games like Rocket League and other things. So Adid and Shadai figured this out, and they built a exploit for the machine learning model that is all over things. Machine learning model was an exploit. This is big news in the AI security space. This is a poster child for the MITRE thing. And they didn't build an adversarial example. They exploited this kind of stupid centroid thing, centroid whitelisting system that Cylance had built. It's not stupid, but there were probably better ways to do this. Part of the reason why they had this problem is they included a lot of string data in their malware model, and that's not a really good idea, as we've seen that's one of the oldest attacks against machine learning models, packing good strings, and that's how the exploit worked out in this case. So what would actual security from machine learning models work out? And here's my opinions with some pontificating. So first thing, it's still software. Do the basics. So validate your inputs. If you're taking in a PNG file, make sure that it hasn't got a weird payload that Pillow, your Python library, is going to run. Some old versions of Pillow, which is one of the biggest the biggest libraries for handling images in Python, had a remote code execution exploit. And if you're using one of those old versions of Pillow, you can get popped fairly easily with someone sending a image file that's got some issue. Double check your pickles. It's really easy to get pickles are RCEs inherently, and this is how a lot of machine learning models are distributed on the internet. If you want to download a model from Hugging face, it's entirely possible you get sent a pickle, and to open that pickle, you have to run remote untrusted code on your machine. But machine learning people do this because that is the normal way of distributing a model, because models get complicated, and pickle is an easy way of doing this. Check your deployments for CVEs. So, scan your Docker containers, make sure all the packages you're installing don't have a CVE, and then check, like, for example, the pillow exploit that you had. Make sure you don't have that. Harden everything, so make sure you have a whole big complicated machine learning pipeline for doing inference. Make sure that all of that's hidden, and there's a one hardened front endpoint that they go to, and everything else is hardened as much as you can. And the last one, which is broken refrain in security, is secure your S3 buckets. That's happened. There's been places that have had people messing with their data sets on S3 because they messed up. This is the Institute for Ethical AI and Machine Learning recommendations. And you can see a lot of these are basically classic exploits, just renamed for machine learning stuff. So artifact exploit injection, that's your file. Server-side request forwardry, all these things are things that normally happen in an OPSEC environment, cloud deployment. You can get all that sort of stuff happening. It's no different from machine learning models. Don't think you're special because you're using deep learning. Okay, so once you have done the basics, and only after you've done the basics, to make sure that your S3 bucket does thing, the next thing you should think about is, well, this is probably, before you really start embarking on this, your data set is more valuable than any model you ever deploy. Your models are sort of disposable. Your data set is sometimes irrecoverable. If someone deletes that permanently of your cloud infrastructure, you can never get it back. If your cluster FS messes up, you're messed. You're hosed. If the attackers get hold of your data set, they can ransomware this because it's worth much more than a thing. A lot of companies have figured this out, that investing in data engineers and data set quality is much more effective of an investment than investing in machine learning, in more data scientists. But this doubly applies to security. Make sure that, like, if you're saving a data set, write it to a write-only S3 bucket that has no ability to overwrite data, and then use a historical system so that a hacker cannot go along and delete old data. Just have versions of stuff, and then make a pipeline that picks up the right version and does the right thing. If they have the ability to delete your data, that is mess with it. Even subtly, you can get screwed. This is another thing that security people understand very intricately well, but data scientists don't necessarily, because it's not their environment and they shouldn't have to. You need layers in your security. If you just have a machine learning model checking whether your PE file is detonating, you're now vulnerable to living off the land attacks, or you're vulnerable to all sorts of things. You should have a dozen things. Many layers of security to prevent, the phishing protection to prevent the PE file from getting on your system, frequently uploaded things for that, and signatures to make sure that you are catching all the stuff that's really important, that is recent, so you don't even bother your machine learning model if emotet's dropped on your machine and you have the hash for it, and you're like, okay, cool, just don't run it, don't even bother wasting compute on this thing. Rules, observability, machine learning thing. And if you're deploying on a self-driving car, well, this is one of the classic examples for adversarial examples. Well, what if they put an adversarial sticker on the stop sign? Okay, what if they just took out the stop sign? Just removed it. They don't need to make up a very intricate, difficult, delicate attack with a sticker on the stop sign, they could just take a hacksaw and remove it. So you should be aware that stop signs might not be there, and maybe you should have a database. This would require geofencing and things. Oh, cool. Here's all my stop signs in the entire city, and I have an agreement with the cities that they're going to tell me when they install new stop signs and traffic lights, and they're going to communicate between my car and the traffic lights, and we're going to do double checks to make sure that my Tesla or the other self-driving car is aware of how the traffic is going to be independent of the road sign conditions, so that if there's snowing or hail or a tree grew in the way, you've got a backup of a database. That's a layer of security in your self-driving car that is probably more important than adversarial robustness. And there's so many other layers of security in your self-driving car that you can probably put in there other than adversarial robustness. Another thing, don't deploy and forget. They are models that are, companies do not like retraining very expensive models. There is if you have a large language model and there's a vulnerability, that large language model might have cost $20 million to train and just compute. It might have cost the amount of CO2 Vegas generates in 6 months to train that model by itself. They don't want to redeploy that. So they don't think, and a lot of companies don't even think about it. They train a model, deploy it, and they're like, cool, we're done. We have solved spam forever. And there's bypasses, or they've solved blah forever. You can't just sit there. When you're deploying a product, you have a responsibility to your customers, you have a responsibility to your people, that you're going to monitor it and make sure that it's still working, that there isn't a bug. And machine learning models have a whole new range of bugs that you think. Back to the thing, you could have a bypass where like a new malware family shows up, or a new spam family, or your self-driving car doesn't recognize that new other car because it looks kind of funky. It doesn't recognize that as a car because it has weird tail lights, and it suddenly start getting a bunch of crashes into it. You can't just sit there and like think that any model is going to perform well over time. You have to monitor it, and this is really hard. In security, you do not in the real world, you do not have access to the labels. I made this graph knowing all the labels post priori. A priori, you have no idea what the label is. So how do you know whether you're making an error if you just have the estimate? I have my prediction. I don't have a label, so I can't check whether I'm right. You have to build estimates and complicated systems, and this is a huge investment to do correctly. But we need to make those investments. And the last, penultimate point is you have to understand your attackers. So attacking a self-driving car, your attackers might just want to embarrass you, or they might want to find a bug, and now they've got to try to get a bounty out of you. But they're just trying to embarrass you and get a bounty. There's not that much value in confusing a car, so it's not going to be a widespread attack. It's going to happen because people are going to want to embarrass you as if you think, but it's not as valuable as getting ransomware in a hospital. A hospital has to be running. They're going to give you the $5 million to unransomware the hospital. You get an immediate monetary value in bypassing the systems for the security systems for that. You have to actually do the threat modeling. You can't just assume that you're going to be attacked in this one way because it's a sexier way because you really want to do the math to defend yourself, because I want to do that research, and so I'm going to make up a threat model so that I can do that research in industry. If you're in academia, I think you should be doing research into model robustness is important, and it's probably a breakthrough in this thing might be needed to bring the machine learning model, the whole field of machine learning forward, but it's not a security problem. The last thing is be a moving target, and this relates back to like the drift. But don't just retrain a new model. You have to make new features. You've got a security onion. You have to make new layers in that onion. You can't just sit there because security people are going to innovate. But you make new features for your model. Don't just sit there on the model. One company has a really nice way of being a moving target for their model. They have a bank of many times more features than they actually need, and they use a subset every month. And they do spam, so they have a lot of behavioral data. So they use a subset of the data of the features that they could use each month. This means each month's model is not as good as it could be. So if you use more features, you could probably train up a better spam model. But this month's model, and it's not month, it's week, but this week's model performs and behaves fundamentally different from next week's model. So the spammers might be figuring out how to bypass this week's model and figure out a bypass, but it's definitely not going to work next week because you're just moving ahead. You're being a moving target. They're going to figure out a bypass each week, but if you can make sure that last week's bypass will not work on this week, you're good. You might not be able to gather enough data in that week for the bypass to figure out things to make sure your model is trained correctly to correctly classify it. But if you change the way the model works, you might not have to worry about that bypass. You have to worry about a different one. So they've taken this concept of being a moving target to the next level, which is actually securing their way, and it is, it is a drop in accuracy, but it is a drop in accuracy that actually gives a good trade-off that they have found that significantly improves their stuff. And finally, respond quickly. What's the turnaround for training a new model? So what Google did, one of the embarrassing things that Google had was in their pictures product. They were misclassifying black people as gorillas, which is really super racist and awful, and they didn't do their model correctly. The way they responded was they removed all primates from their data set so that the model can't misclassify black people as gorillas because the model doesn't know what a gorilla is. That's how they responded. But the thing is, they responded quickly, and that actually is not, it's bad, but it's not the worst idea. If you want to prevent this from happening and you only have a few days to figure out how to quickly get your model to stop doing this, it might take you 6 more months to gather the data to prevent this from happening. But you need to respond in 3 days, so quickly removing the primates was a quick way for them to respond to this one problem, and then to buy them time to actually invest and do it properly over time. They still have a little bit of issues with this, but this is one of the bias in machine learning, all sorts of papers, not to talk about that, but they responded quickly in that sort of shitty way, but it was a response that thing. Your code language model may generate vulnerabilities. You've got a Codex might suggest code for you that has a vulnerability in it because it's memorized the code from a Stack Overflow post, and that's bad. Like a lot of people are going to be, oh, cool, Codex did this, include it because I'm going to trust the machine learning model, and well, you've now got a vulnerability that Codex put there. That is bad, and we have found large language models suggesting vulnerabilities to include in your code, and Microsoft sat on their ass for 6 months before they started doing anything. Other linters and code editors fixed it quickly because they are in the security space and they understand that they have to respond. But the people in the machine learning space, they sat on it for 6 months because how do I solve this problem with memorizing things? It's so much harder. Like, you kind of have to do something quickly, Google by Microsoft. You can't just like sit on your ass for 6 months. So I think machine learning should be held to that standard. Anyway, so questions? I have If you want references, you can find them online on the GitHub. So, yeah.